There is a particular kind of weight that comes with being the son of the most powerful man in the country, a weight that is different depending on where you fall in the order of sons, different again depending on what your father expects of you, and different again depending on what the world eventually asks you to do with the name you were given. Tairano Shigehira was born into this weight. He was the fifth son of Tairano Kiyomori, the man who had made the Taira into the most powerful family in Japan. By the time Shigehira was old enough to understand what his name meant, his father's power was already close to its peak, and the world that Shigehira grew up in was a world that had been built, piece by piece, by the man whose son he was. The fifth son occupies a specific position in a family like the Taira. The eldest sons carry the expectations of succession, the weight of being the ones who will eventually inherit the position their father has built. They are watched, they are trained, every decision about their future is made with the larger trajectory of the family in mind. The fifth son is watched less. This is not a small thing. It creates a different kind of childhood, a childhood with more room in it, a childhood where the things you do are less likely to be read as signals about the future of the clan, and more likely to simply be the things a young man does. Shigehira grew up with this room. He was a Taira, and that meant everything that being a Taira meant in Kyoto in the 1160s and 1170s. But he was not the heir. He was not the second son managing the political alliances. He was the fifth son, and the fifth son had a kind of freedom that the others did not. What he did with that freedom is recorded in fragments, the kind of fragments that survive about a person who was not, for most of his early life, considered important enough to document thoroughly. He was known for his appearance. The records describe him as remarkably handsome, a young man whose physical presence was noted by the people around him in the way that physical presence was noted in the Heian world, as a quality with its own significance, its own weight in the social calculations of a court that valued beauty as much as it valued lineage. He was known for his temperament. The word that appears in the records is closer to bold or impetuous, a young man with a quick temper and a directness that stood out in a court built around indirection, around the careful management of every interaction, through layers of protocol and implication. He was, in other words, not entirely suited to the world he had been born into. This mattered less than it might have in a different family. The Taira were warriors who had become courtiers, a military family that had spent a generation acquiring the trappings of the Heian aristocracy without entirely losing the qualities that had made them formidable in the first place. Shigehira's directness, his quickness to anger, his physical presence were not disqualifying qualities in this context. They were, in some ways, qualities that the Taira valued, remnants of the warrior identity that the family had not entirely traded away for the silk and ceremony of the court. He was a Taira son who looked like a Taira son was supposed to look, who carried himself the way a man with his name was supposed to carry himself. The world he grew up in was the world at its height. His father had placed an infant emperor on the throne. His sister, Kenrei Moin, was the mother of that emperor. The Taira controlled the court, controlled the provincial governorships, controlled the flow of wealth through the inland sea trade that had been the foundation of the family's rise. Shigehira grew up believing, as everyone in his world believed, that this was simply how things were. The Taira were powerful. They would remain powerful. The arrangement of the world around his family's position was not something that required explanation or justification. It was simply the world. He had a position appropriate to his rank. He held court titles, the kind of titles that the sons of powerful families accumulated as a matter of course, markers of status that came with income and with the expectation of further advancement as circumstances allowed. He had a wife. Her name was Sukano Tsubone, and she was a woman of the court, the kind of marriage that Taira sons made, alliances that wove the family further into the fabric of the aristocracy it had joined. He had, by the standards of the world he was born into, everything that a fifth son of the most powerful family in Japan could reasonably expect: a position, a marriage, a future that would unfold within the structures his father had built, structures that seemed, in the 1170s, as permanent as anything in the world could seem. Then the war came. The rebellion of 1180, the Minamoto in the east, the gradual realization that the world the Taira had built was not as permanent as it had appeared. Shigehira was 25 years old when the first stirrings of rebellion reached Kyoto. He was a young man with a temper and a presence and a name that carried weight, a fifth son who had grown up in the shadow of his father's achievements, without yet having achieved anything of his own. The war was about to give him the opportunity to achieve something. What he achieved would follow him for the rest of his life, and into the centuries after his life ended. Kyoto, in the years before the war, was a city that Shigehira moved through as a man who belonged to it completely. This is worth dwelling on, because the city he belonged to was about to become, for a brief period, the city he was responsible for the loss of, and the contrast between belonging to a place and being the reason it can no longer be inhabited is one of the central tensions of his story. But before any of that, there was simply the capital, and Shigehira moving through it the way a young man of his position moved through it, with the specific confidence that comes from knowing that the city, in some fundamental sense, exists for people like you. The Heian capital was organized around the seasons in a way that gave the year a specific rhythm, a sequence of festivals and ceremonies and observances that marked the passage of time not as an abstract continuity, but as a series of specific occasions, each with its own customs, its own appropriate activities, its own aesthetic requirements. Shigehira participated in this rhythm. The records that survive from before the war show him at court functions, at the seasonal observances, at the ceremonies that a man of his rank was expected to attend. He was not, by these records, a particularly notable courtier. He was not known for poetry in the way that some of his relatives were. He was not known for political acumen. He was known for being Tairano Shigehira, the fifth son of Kiyomori, a young man whose family name opened doors that his individual accomplishments had not yet opened on their own. The temperament that would later become significant was already visible in these years, though in the context of court life it expressed itself in ways that were more social than consequential. He had a reputation for directness in conversation, for saying things that other courtiers would have found ways to imply rather than state. This is the kind of quality that can read very differently depending on context. In the careful, indirect world of the Heian court, directness could seem refreshing to some people and crude to others. Shigehira's directness seems to have produced both reactions, depending on who was describing him and in what context. What is consistent across the descriptions is that he was a presence. He was not someone who blended into the background of court life. He was noticed. The relationship between Shigehira and the city of Kyoto was, in these years, the relationship of someone who had never had to think about what the city meant, because the city had always simply been there, the given context within which his life happened, as unremarkable in its presence as the air. He had grown up in it. He knew its streets, its temples, its seasonal rhythms, the specific quality of its light in each month of the year. He did not think of it as fragile. He did not think of it as something that could be lost. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Shigehira in these years before the war. He was a young man who had never had to consider the possibility that the world he had grown up in might not continue exactly as it was. The Taira were powerful. The capital was the capital. These were not propositions that required defending. They were simply the facts of his existence. In 1180, these facts began to come apart. The rebellion in the East was, at first, something distant, a problem for the generals and the strategists, not something that touched the daily life of a fifth son attending court functions in Kyoto. But the distance closed quickly. The Minamoto forces under Yoritomo were not simply a provincial disturbance that would be put down in the ordinary course of things. They were growing, they were winning engagements that the Taira commanders had expected to win easily. The court began to feel, for the first time in a generation, something that it had not had to feel for a long time. Uncertainty. Shigehira in 1180 was 25. He had spent his entire life in a world where his family's power was the foundation of everything else. The uncertainty that was beginning to spread through the capital in 1180 was not yet, for him, a personal crisis. It was a problem that his father and his brothers and the Taira military leadership would solve, the way the Taira had always solved problems, through the combination of military capability and political maneuvering that had built the family's position in the first place. He did not yet know that the solution to this particular problem would involve him directly, that the war that was beginning in the eastern provinces would, within a year, place him at the center of one of the most consequential decisions of the entire conflict, a decision that would define how he was remembered for the rest of his life, and for the 8 centuries after it. The capital he knew so well was about to become the place from which an order would be given, an order that would change the relationship between the Taira and the rest of Japan in ways that no military victory could undo. To understand what happened at Nara in the 12th month of 1180, you have to understand what Nara was, and what the great temples there represented, not just religiously, but politically, in the world that the Taira were trying to hold together. Nara had been the capital of Japan before Kyoto. It had been the center of Japanese Buddhism since Buddhism had become a major force in Japanese life, centuries before the Taira or the Minamoto had existed as families of any significance. The great temples of Nara, Todaiji, and Kofukuji above all others were not simply religious institutions. They were among the largest landholders in Japan. They maintained their own armed forces, the Sohei, the warrior monks who had been a factor in Japanese politics for as long as anyone could remember. They had political influence that operated independently of, and sometimes in opposition to, the court in Kyoto. When the Minamoto Rebellion began in 1180, the great temples of Nara made their position known. They did not formally declare for the Minamoto. The situation was more complicated than a simple choice of sides, but the warrior monks of Kofukuji in particular had a long history of friction with the Taira, and as the rebellion gained momentum, elements within the Nara temples began to move toward open hostility. There were incidents. Taira officials traveling near Nara were attacked. The Sohei began to mobilize in ways that the Taira could not ignore. From Kyoto, the situation in Nara looked like exactly the kind of threat that the Taira, already fighting a war in the east, could not afford to have developing so close to the capital. Kiyomori's response was to send a force to Nara. The stated purpose was to suppress the Sohei hostility, to remind the temples of where the actual power in Japan resided, to prevent the situation from becoming a second front in a war the Taira were already fighting. The force was placed under Shigehira's command. This is the moment where the fifth son, the young man who had grown up in the relative freedom of not being the heir, stepped into the position that would define the rest of his life. Why Shigehira specifically was given this command is not entirely clear from the surviving records. He had military experience, the kind of experience that Taira sons of his generation accumulated as a matter of course. He was not the most senior of the available commanders, but he was not junior either. What is clear is that the command was given, and that Shigehira took his force toward Nara in the 12th month of 1180, in the cold, dark days of the year's end, toward a confrontation that no one, including Shigehira himself, fully anticipated the scale of. The engagement at Nara began as what military engagements of this period typically began as: a force arriving, a confrontation with the local defenders, in this case the Sohei of Todaiji and Kohukuji, fighting in and around the temple precincts. What happened next is described in the chronicles with a specificity that suggests the events made a profound impression on everyone who heard about them, an impression that has not faded in the 8 centuries since. It was night. The fighting had been going on for some time, and somewhere in the chaos of the engagement, fire broke out. The chronicles do not agree on exactly how the fire started. Some accounts suggest it began deliberately, that Shigehira's forces set fires as a tactic to drive out defenders who were using the temple buildings as fortified positions. Other accounts suggest it began accidentally, that torches carried by soldiers in the dark ignited buildings that were, by their nature, extraordinarily flammable, the wooden structures of Japanese temple architecture, with their dry timber and their paper screens and their thatch. What is not disputed is what happened once the fire started. Nara in the 12th month is a city in the grip of winter, and the winds that come down from the surrounding hills in this season are strong and dry. The fire that started that night did not stay contained. It spread through Todaiji. It spread through Kohukuji. It consumed buildings that had stood for centuries, structures that represented not just religious significance, but architectural and artistic achievement on a scale that had few equivalents anywhere in Japan. And inside Todaiji, in the great hall that had been built to house it, was the Daibutsu, the great Buddha of Nara, a bronze statue that had stood for over 4 centuries, one of the largest bronze Buddha images in the world, a symbol that was recognized throughout Japan as something close to the physical embodiment of the Buddhist faith in its national dimension. The fire reached the hall. The wooden structure that housed and protected the great bronze figure burned around it. The Daibutsu's head melted in the heat and fell from its body. By morning, Todaiji and Kohukuji were largely destroyed. The death toll among the Sohei and the people who had been in the temples when the fire broke out, monks, and also ordinary people from the surrounding area who had taken shelter in the temple precincts believing them safe, was severe. The chronicles give numbers that vary, but all of them describe a catastrophe on a scale that went far beyond the suppression of an armed threat. Nara, the ancient capital, the center of Japanese Buddhism for 4 centuries, had burned in a single night, and the man whose forces had been there, the man under whose command the engagement had taken place, was Tyranno Shigehira. The fire at Nara needs to be understood not just as an event but as a rupture, a before and after that changed the terms on which everything that followed would be judged. Before Nara, the war between the Taira and the Minamoto was, in the understanding of most people in Japan, a conflict between 2 warrior families over political dominance. It was the kind of conflict that had happened before and would happen again, the normal, if violent, mechanism by which power shifted between the great houses. After Nara, the war was something else. After Nara, the Taira were the family that had burned the great Buddha. The religious dimension of what happened cannot be overstated. Buddhism in 12th century Japan was not a private matter of individual faith. It was woven into every level of the society, into the legitimacy of the imperial institution itself, into the cosmology through which people understood the relationship between the human world and the larger order of which it was a part. The Daibutsu at Todaiji had been built in the 8th century as a national project, an expression of the aspiration that the Japanese state could embody and protect the Buddhist teaching on a scale appropriate to its significance. For 4 centuries, it had stood. Emperors had made pilgrimages to it. It had survived earthquakes and the ordinary wear of centuries. It had not survived the night Shigehira's forces came to Nara. The response in Kyoto was not what Shigehira might have expected from a military action against a hostile force. There was no celebration of a threat neutralized. There was, instead, something close to horror. The court, which depended on the cosmological framework that Buddhism provided for its own legitimacy, understood immediately that what had happened at Nara was not a victory. It was a catastrophe that happened to have been inflicted by Taira forces, which meant that the Taira now bore the weight of having caused it, regardless of what the military justification for the Nara expedition had been. Kiyomori's reaction to the news from Nara is recorded with a complexity that reflects the complexity of his own position. He was the head of the Taira. The forces that had burned Nara had been acting, ultimately, under his authority, even if the specific decisions that led to the fire had been made by Shigehira in the chaos of the engagement itself. Kiyomori did not, by most accounts, express the horror that the rest of the court was expressing. He had a war to fight. The threat from Nara had been real. The Sohei had been mobilizing against Taira interests. Whatever had happened to the temples in the course of neutralizing that threat was, from Kiyomori's perspective, a cost of the war, regrettable perhaps, but not something that changed the strategic calculus. This response, or the perception of this response, did not help how the Taira were subsequently viewed. Shigehira himself returned to Kyoto from Nara as the commander whose forces had been present when the Daibutsu burned. The records do not give us a clear picture of his internal response to what had happened. What they give us is the external situation he returned to, a capital where the event was being discussed with a specific quality of dread, where the religious establishment was processing what amounted to a wound to the cosmological order itself, and where Shigehira's name was now attached, permanently, to that wound. He had been 25 years old when he led the force to Nara. He returned from Nara as something different, not a hero, not, in any straightforward sense, even a successful commander, despite the fact that the immediate military objective, the suppression of the Sohei threat, had been achieved. He returned as the man associated with Nara and Nara after that night meant something that overwhelmed any military assessment of what had been accomplished there. The war continued. The Minamoto in the east were not affected by what had happened at Nara, except insofar as the event added to the growing sense across Japan that the Taira had lost something beyond the merely military, that their claim to represent the proper order of things had been damaged in a way that battles alone could not repair. Shigehira went on to other engagements. The war that had begun in 1180 would continue for several more years, through the campaigns that took the Taira from Kyoto to Fukuhara, and eventually into the long retreat toward the western provinces. But Nara went with him. It would go with him to Ichinotani, where he would fight again, and where his war would end in a way that was, in its own manner, connected to everything that had happened that night in 1180, though no one, least of all Shigehira, could have known exactly how the connection would unfold. In the months after Nara, Shigehira continued to function as a Taira commander, which is to say he continued to fight in the war that was consuming more and more of the family's resources and attention. But something had changed in how he moved through the world, something that the records gesture toward without ever stating directly, because the records of this period are not interested in the internal lives of even prominent figures, only in their actions and the consequences of those actions. What can be inferred is that Shigehira was now a marked man, in a sense that had nothing to do with military reputation. Kyoto in 1181 was a city that had absorbed the shock of Nara and was processing it in the way that the Heian world processed things, through poetry, through religious observance, through the elaborate network of communication and gossip that connected the court families and the temples and the various factions that had interests in how the war was being conducted and who was responsible for what. Shigehira's name appears in this network as a specific kind of reference point, the man whose forces had been at Nara, the man associated with the burning of the Daibutsu, regardless of how the specific chain of events that led to the fire was actually understood by anyone with detailed knowledge of what had happened. Kiyomori died in 1181. In the spring, the burning fever that the chronicles describe in such vivid terms, the man who had built the Taira ascendancy dying before he could see how the war he had been fighting would end. His death changed the internal dynamics of the Taira leadership. The sons who remained, Munemori as the new head of the clan, and his brothers, including Shigehira, had to manage not just the war, but the transition of authority within the family, at a moment when the family's position was already under severe pressure. Shigehira's role in this transition is not prominent in the records. He was a commander, one of several brothers who held military positions and fought in the campaigns that followed. He was not, by most accounts, positioned for the highest leadership roles within the clan, which had perhaps always been true, given his position as a younger son, but which may also have been affected by the specific weight that his name now carried. The military campaigns of 1181 through 1183 took the Taira through a series of engagements in the provinces surrounding Kyoto and beyond, campaigns against Minamoto no Yoritomo's forces in the east and against Yoshinaka's forces in the north, the campaigns that would eventually lead to Kurikara Toge and the collapse of Taira control over the capital. Shigehira fought in some of these engagements. The records place him in various locations during this period, a commander among commanders, contributing to a war effort that was, despite occasional successes, gradually losing ground. The specific quality of his experience during these years, what it was like to be Tairano Shigehira in Kyoto in the early 1180s, carrying the association with Nara while also fighting in a war that was not going well, is something the historical record does not directly address. What can be said is that the burden of Nara did not go away. It was not the kind of event that faded as other, more recent events took precedence in the public attention. If anything, as the war continued and the Taira position deteriorated, Nara became part of the larger narrative that was forming about the Taira, the narrative that would eventually become central to how the Heike Monogatari told the story of the clan's fall. The Taira were powerful. The Taira had overreached. The Taira had committed an act so severe that it had offended not just political rivals, but the cosmological order itself. And the Taira were now inexorably falling. Shigehira was part of this narrative in a way that was specific and personal, in a way that none of his brothers or other Taira commanders quite were. He carried Nara the way a person carries a specific weight into every subsequent engagement, into the retreat from Kyoto in 1183, into the campaigns of the following winter, into Ichinotani. By the time the Taira abandoned Kyoto in the summer of 1183, Shigehira had been living with the association for nearly 3 years. The retreat westward, the establishment of new positions in the provinces along the inland sea, the gradual contraction of Taira territory as Minamoto forces under Yoshitsune pressed from multiple directions, all of this Shigehira experienced as a commander who was, by this point, simply one of the figures trying to hold together a military situation that was deteriorating faster than anyone could fully account for. Nara was 3 years in the past. Ichinotani was coming, and Ichinotani would be the place where Shigehira's war, in the sense of fighting as a free man for the Taira cause, came to an end. The retreat from Kyoto in the summer of 1183 was, for the Taira, a movement into a different kind of existence. For 3 years, they had been fighting a war while remaining, in their own understanding, the legitimate center of Japanese political life, the family that controlled the emperor and the regalia and the institutional apparatus of the court, fighting to suppress a rebellion against a settled order. After Kyoto, they were something else. They were the forces of an emperor who no longer controlled the capital, fighting to recover what had been lost, rather than to suppress a threat to what they held. The psychological shift this represented was significant, and it affected every Taira commander, Shigehira among them. The western provinces where the Taira established their new positions were, in many ways, home ground. The inland sea had been the foundation of Taira power for generations. The trade routes and the provincial governorships that had built the family's wealth before Kiyomori had transformed that wealth into national political power. Shigehira, like his brothers, had connections in these provinces, familiarity with the territory, the kind of local knowledge that came from a family whose roots were genuinely Western, even after generations of involvement in the politics of Kyoto. This familiarity provided some advantages, but it could not by itself reverse the military situation. The campaigns of late 1183 and early 1184 were campaigns of consolidation for the Taira, attempts to establish defensible positions in the western provinces from which they could, eventually, mount a recovery of the territory they had lost. Ichinotani, on the coast near what is now Kobe, was one of these positions. The geography was favorable in theory. A narrow stretch of coast, mountains to the north that were considered too steep for a serious attack, the sea to the south providing both a defensive barrier and, if necessary, an avenue of retreat via the Taira fleet, which remained the most powerful naval force in Japan. The Taira fortified this position through the early weeks of 1184, building the kind of defenses that the geography suggested would be sufficient. Shigehira was among the commanders at Ichinotani. By this point, he had been fighting for nearly 4 years, since the campaign that had taken him to Nara in the winter of 1180. He was 28 years old. The man who had been a fifth son with relative freedom, known for his temper and his appearance and not much else, had become, over 4 years of war, something else. A commander, a man with a reputation, though the reputation was complicated, weighted by Nara in ways that his military record alone could not offset. A man who had been fighting for most of his adult life, who had seen the world he grew up in contract from the capital of Japan to a fortified position on a narrow beach, and who was now, in the early weeks of 1184, preparing to defend that position against an enemy that had not yet been stopped by anything the Taira had tried. The mood among the Taira at Ichinotani in those weeks is described in the chronicles with a quality that combines determination and something else, something closer to the specific awareness that comes from having been pushed back repeatedly, of knowing that the positions you are defending now are not positions you chose from strength, but positions you have retreated to. There was still music in the Taira camp in the evenings. This is the detail that would become significant in connection with a different Taira warrior, Tairano Atsumori, whose flute would be found on this same beach in the aftermath of the battle that was coming. The Taira, even in retreat, even in a fortified position on a beach they had built defenses on because they had nowhere else to go, remained, in some essential way, themselves. The music continued. The forms were maintained. Shigehira was part of this world, this final iteration of the Taira court in arms, the civilization that had produced him continuing to express itself even as the military situation around it deteriorated. What Shigehira thought in those final days before the battle about Nara, about the 4 years since that night, about what his life had become since he was 25 and had led a force toward a temple complex expecting a straightforward suppression of a local threat, is not recorded. The records give us the military situation, the positions, the preparations. They do not give us the interior life of a man who was, by this point, carrying something that the war itself had not given him the opportunity to set down, a weight that had been with him through every campaign since Nara, and that was about to become, in a way he could not anticipate, the defining fact of the rest of his life. The Battle of Ichinotani was about to begin. The Battle of Ichinotani has appeared before in this channel from other perspectives, the perspective of Kumagai Naozane, who fought there and whose encounter with a young Taira warrior on the beach became one of the most enduring images in Japanese literature. This is the same battle, seen from inside the Taira lines, from the perspective of a commander who was there not as a witness to someone else's story, but as a participant in his own. Shigehira was positioned in the western defenses, the fortifications along the beach approach that the Taira had built to stop an attack from the direction they expected it. The attack, when it came from 2 directions at once. The frontal assault that the fortifications had been built to withstand, and the descent from the cliffs to the north, Yoshitsune's maneuver that the Taira had not believed possible. The chaos that followed has been described before, the lines breaking, the rush toward the ships, the battle becoming a rout. Shigehira was in the middle of this, what the records describe as a commander fighting in the collapse of his own position, trying to organize some kind of resistance or retreat as the battle became unmanageable around him. The specific sequence of events that led to Shigehira's capture is recorded with more detail than is typical for individual commanders in the chaos of Ichinotani, because what happened to him was, in itself, notable. He was on horseback, attempting to reach the ships, in the same general movement toward the sea that was happening across the Taira position as the battle collapsed. His horse was struck. This is the kind of detail that, in the chronicles of this period, often marks the moment where a commander's fate shifts from the general chaos of battle to something more specific, more personal. A horse that has carried a warrior through a campaign that represents, in a very direct sense, the warrior's mobility, and therefore his options, suddenly failing at the critical moment removes those options all at once. Shigehira's horse went down or was disabled in the chaos near the beach. He was left, in the moment that mattered most, without the means to reach the ships the way the warriors around him were reaching them. What happened next involved another Taira warrior, a retainer who, seeing Shigehira's situation, gave up his own horse to him, an act of loyalty that was, in the warrior culture of this period, understood as one of the highest expressions of the retainer's duty, the willingness to sacrifice one's own chances of survival for the sake of one's lord. Shigehira took the horse. The retainer who had given it to him did not escape. Shigehira, on the borrowed horse, attempted to reach the ships. He did not make it. The pursuing Minamoto forces, specifically a group of warriors from the eastern provinces, caught up with him before he reached the water. What followed was not a battle in the sense of a contested fight to the death. Shigehira, on a horse that was not his own, in the chaos of a battle that had already been lost, surrounded by pursuing warriors, was taken alive. He was captured. The capture of Shigehira was, for the Minamoto, a significant outcome of Ichinotani, beyond the general military victory the battle represented. Shigehira was a son of Kiyomori, a member of the Taira leadership, a commander whose name carried weight within the clan, and, because of Nara, weight that extended far beyond the clan, into the religious establishment and the broader population that had been horrified by what happened at Todaiji. A living Taira commander, specifically Shigehira, was not simply a military trophy. He was a symbol, and what would be done with him, how he would be treated, what would eventually happen to him, were questions that carried significance far beyond the ordinary calculations of what to do with a captured enemy commander. Shigehira was taken from Ichinotani as a prisoner. The man who had ridden to Nara 4 years earlier as a Taira commander, leading a force on what was meant to be a straightforward military operation, who had returned from Nara carrying an association that would follow him for the rest of the war, was now, at 28, a captive of the family that had been fighting his family for 4 years. The Taira fleet sailed from Ichinotani carrying the survivors of the battle, including the boy emperor and his mother Kenrei Mo-in, toward the next position, toward Yashima, and eventually toward Dan-nora. Shigehira did not sail with them. He was going east, not west. He was going, though he could not have known the specific details yet, toward Kamakura, toward Yoritomo, toward an encounter with the leadership of the family that was, within a year, going to destroy everything Shigehira had been part of. To be captured alive in the warrior culture of 12th century Japan was a complicated status. It was not, in itself, shameful in the way that later samurai traditions would come to regard surviving capture. The codes that would eventually make death preferable to capture an absolute requirement of warrior honor had not yet fully crystallized in the way they would centuries later. But it was also not a neutral status. A captured commander was a problem for everyone involved, a person whose continued existence raised questions that his death would have resolved. For Shigehira specifically, the questions were sharper than they would have been for almost any other Taira commander. If he had simply been a military leader, captured in the ordinary course of a battle, his fate would likely have followed the patterns that governed such situations. Patterns that included the possibility of execution, the possibility of imprisonment, the possibility, in some cases, of being held as a hostage or bargaining piece in the larger political negotiations that wars eventually require. But Shigehira was not just a military leader, he was the man associated with Nara. The religious establishment of Japan had not forgotten what happened at Todaiji in 1180. The destruction of the Daibutsu was not the kind of event that faded from significance as other events took precedence. If anything, the 4 years since Nara had given the event time to settle into the larger narrative of the war, the narrative in which the Taira's defeat was understood, by many, as a kind of cosmic justice, the consequence of an offense against the Buddhist order that could not go unanswered. Shigehira, captured and alive, was the embodiment of that offense, in human form, now in the hands of the family that was winning the war that the offense had supposedly brought about. The journey east took Shigehira through territory he had likely never seen before. He had grown up in Kyoto, fought in the western provinces, been part of the Taira world that was centered on the capital and the inland sea. The road east, toward Kamakura, took him through provinces that were Minamoto territory, the heartland of the family that had been fighting his family for 4 years, the territory where Yoritomo had built the foundations of what would become the Kamakura government. He traveled as a prisoner, under guard, through a landscape that belonged, in every meaningful sense, to the people who had defeated him. What Shigehira experienced on this journey is not directly recorded, but the journey itself tells us something about the situation he was in. He was not executed immediately. This is significant. A captured commander whose fate had already been decided would typically not survive a long journey to a distant location. The fact that Shigehira was being taken to Kamakura, to Yoritomo directly, suggests that his fate was, at this point, still being determined, that the question of what to do with him was important enough to require Yoritomo's personal involvement, rather than being settled by the commanders who had captured him in the field. The journey east also took Shigehira away from everything that had been his life. His wife Sukino Tsubone remained in the west, or in Kyoto, separated from him by the war and by his capture, in circumstances that the records do not detail. His brothers, the surviving Taira leadership, were sailing west with the fleet, toward Yashima, and the positions that would, within months, lead to Dan-nura and the final destruction of the Taira as a military force. Shigehira was going in the opposite direction, toward Kamakura, toward Yoritomo, toward an uncertain fate that was connected to events from 4 years earlier, events that had happened before the war had reached its current terminal phase. He was, in a sense, already separated from the war that was about to end his family's power. He was facing something else, something that had been waiting since Nara, and that was now, finally, catching up to him. The journey to Kamakura was long. The distance between Kyoto and Kamakura, in the geography of late 12th century Japan, represented not just physical distance, but a kind of conceptual distance. The journey from the ancient center of Japanese civilization to the new center that Yoritomo was in the process of building, a journey that traced, in its own way, the larger shift that the Genpei War represented, the movement of power away from the court and its ceremonies and toward the warrior government that would govern Japan for centuries afterward. Shigehira traveled this distance as a prisoner, under guard, in the spring of 1184. The accounts of this journey that survive focus on a specific aspect of it, an aspect that might seem, at first, incongruous given the circumstances. Shigehira on this journey is described as composing poetry. This requires some unpacking. The Heian aristocratic tradition, the tradition that Shigehira had grown up in, treated poetry not as an occasional or decorative activity, but as a fundamental mode of expression, the medium through which significant moments, significant emotions, significant observations about the world were appropriately articulated. A man of Shigehira's background, facing an uncertain and likely grim fate, traveling through unfamiliar territory as a captive, would have understood poetry as one of the available responses to his situation, perhaps the most available response, the cultural tool that his entire upbringing had equipped him with for exactly this kind of moment. The specific poems that Shigehira composed during this journey, or that are attributed to him from this period, deal with themes that are not surprising given the circumstances, the transience of fortune, the contrast between what had been and what was now, the specific quality of traveling through landscapes that were beautiful in their own right, but that carried, for him, the weight of being landscapes he was passing through as a captive, moving toward an uncertain future, in territory that belonged to the people who had defeated his family. This kind of poetry, poetry of reflection on reversal of fortune, had a long tradition in Japanese literature, going back centuries, to poets and courtiers who had experienced political exile or downfall, and who had, in their poetry, found a way to process and articulate what had happened to them. Shigehira was drawing on this tradition, placing his own experience within a framework that Japanese culture had developed specifically for situations like his. What is notable is how this poetry was received by the people around him during the journey. The guards, the Minamoto warriors escorting him east, were not, by background, men of the Heian poetic tradition. They were Eastern warriors, men whose culture was the culture that Kumagai Naozane came from, the culture of the Kanto Plain, of mounted archery, and direct, practical approaches to most aspects of life. And yet the accounts suggest that Shigehira's poetry, his bearing during the journey, the quality of cultivation that he displayed even as a captive in difficult circumstances, made an impression on these men. This impression matters for understanding what happens in the next phase of Shigehira's story. The captive who arrived in Kamakura was not, to the people who received him, simply the man associated with Nara, the symbol of an offense against the Buddhist order. He was also, to at least some of the people who had escorted him and who would subsequently interact with him, a man of genuine cultivation, someone whose poetry and whose manner suggested a person of real depth, regardless of what he had been involved in 4 years earlier. These two perceptions, Shigehira as the burner of the Daibutsu and Shigehira as a man of cultivation and dignity, even in captivity, would coexist throughout the remainder of his life, and the tension between them is part of what makes his story distinctive among the figures of the Heike Monogatari. He arrived in Kamakura carrying both. Kamakura, in 1184, was not yet the city it would become. Yoritomo had established his base there in 1180, in the early months of his rebellion, and over 4 years it had grown from a strategic choice into something closer to a capital, the administrative center of the territory Yoritomo controlled, the place from which the Minamoto war effort was directed. It was not Kyoto. It did not have the temples and gardens and accumulated aesthetic weight of 4 centuries of imperial civilization. It was a working city, a military and administrative center, built around the practical requirements of governing and fighting a war. Shigehira arrived here in the spring of 1184, a captive from the world Kamakura was in the process of displacing. The meeting between Shigehira and Yoritomo is one of the moments in this story that the chronicles give particular attention to, because the meeting itself carried significance beyond the immediate practical questions of what to do with a captured enemy. Yoritomo was, by 1184, the leader of a movement that had transformed from a rebellion into something close to an alternative center of power for Japan. He had not yet won the war completely. Dan Nora was still a year away, but the trajectory was clear. The man who sat across from Shigehira was the man who was going to determine not just Shigehira's fate, but the shape of Japan's political future. The accounts of this meeting describe Yoritomo treating Shigehira with a degree of formal respect that might seem at first surprising, given who Shigehira was and what he was associated with. Yoritomo is described as acknowledging Shigehira's status, his lineage, the position he had held within the Taira hierarchy. This was not necessarily personal warmth. Yoritomo was, among other things, a man who understood the importance of appearances, of how his treatment of captured enemies would be perceived by the wider world, including by Taira forces who had not yet been defeated, and who might, depending on how this situation was handled, be more or less inclined toward continued resistance or eventual accommodation. But there was also, according to the accounts, something that went beyond pure calculation. Yoritomo is described as being interested in Shigehira as a person, in a way that suggests genuine curiosity about the man who had been at the center of one of the war's most significant and most controversial events. The question of Nara would have been impossible to avoid. What had actually happened that night, from Shigehira's own account, the question of intent versus accident, of what he had ordered and what had simply occurred in the chaos of the engagement, these were questions that Yoritomo, as the man who would ultimately decide Shigehira's fate, had reason to explore. What Shigehira said in response to these questions is not preserved in detail, but the general sense that comes through in the accounts is that Shigehira did not deny his responsibility for what had happened at Nara, even as the specific mechanics of how the fire started remained, as they had always been, somewhat ambiguous. He had been the commander. The force had been under his authority. Whatever the specific sequence of decisions that led to the fire, the responsibility, in the way that responsibility worked in this culture, rested with him. He did not, by the accounts that survive, attempt to deflect this or to argue that he bore no responsibility. This acceptance of responsibility, combined with the dignity and cultivation that Shigehira had displayed during the journey and continued to display in Kamakura, created a specific impression. Shigehira was not, to the people who encountered him in Kamakura, simply a villain who deserved whatever fate awaited him. He was a man who had done something terrible, who acknowledged that he had done it, and who carried himself, in the aftermath, with a quality of bearing that the warrior culture, despite everything, recognized and, in its own way, respected. He was not freed. He remained a captive, but the captivity that followed was not, at least initially, the kind of captivity that ended quickly in execution. Shigehira was going to live for a while in Kamakura as a prisoner whose fate remained for the moment undetermined. The period of Shigehira's captivity in Kamakura produced one of the more unusual relationships recorded in the literature of the Genpei War, a relationship that exists in the space between captor and captive, between the warrior culture of the East and the courtly culture that Shigehira represented, between two people who, under almost any other circumstances, would have had no reason to encounter each other at all. Her name was Sennyu Mae. Sennyu Mae was, according to the accounts, a woman associated with Yoritomo's household, in some versions described as having a connection to Yoritomo's wife, Hojo Masako, or to the household more generally, a woman of some standing within the Kamakura establishment, though her exact position is described differently in different sources. What is consistent across the accounts is that she was assigned, or took it upon herself, to attend to Shigehira during his captivity, and that this attendance became something more than the formal management of a prisoner's basic needs. Shigehira, during this period, continued to do what he had done on the journey east. He composed poetry, he played music, specifically the biwa, the lute that was central to the Heian musical tradition, the same tradition that had produced the flute Atsumori had carried to Ichinotani. These were the skills of his upbringing, the accomplishments that a man of his background and education had cultivated since childhood, and in the circumstances of captivity, they were essentially all he had left. Sennyu Mae responded to this. The accounts describe her appreciation for Shigehira's music and poetry, an appreciation that, in the context of Kamakura, a city built around practical, martial culture rather than the aesthetic refinements of Kyoto, represented something unusual, a recognition of value in exactly the kind of cultivation that the Eastern warrior world did not typically prioritize. The relationship that developed between them is described in some accounts with the specific emotional register of genuine connection, two people finding, in an unlikely set of circumstances, something that mattered to both of them. It is worth pausing on what this represents. Shigehira, at this point in his story, was the man associated with Nara, a prisoner whose ultimate fate remained undetermined, a member of a family that was, even as this relationship was developing, being destroyed in the West, the campaigns that would lead to Dan Nora unfolding during this same period. And in the midst of this, in Kamakura, in the household of the family that had destroyed his own, he found someone who valued what he could offer, who responded to his poetry and his music not as the accomplishments of an enemy or a curiosity, but as things of genuine worth. The chronicles that record this relationship do not present it as romantic in any straightforward sense, though some later interpretations have read it that way. What the chronicles emphasize is the human connection, the recognition across the lines that the war had drawn, of a person, not a symbol, not a representative of a hated cause, but a specific individual with specific gifts and a specific way of being in the world that, even in the worst circumstances, remained recognizable and, to at least one person in Kamakura, valuable. This relationship would not change Shigehira's ultimate fate, but it represents something important about how he was perceived, during this period of his life, by at least some of the people around him, not simply as the man who burned the Daibutsu, also as a person. While Shigehira lived in Kamakura, under captivity but with the specific quality of life that his relationship with Senjuno Mae and the recognition of his cultivation had produced, the war that had brought him there was ending. Danura was fought in the 3rd month of 1185, while Shigehira was still in Kamakura. The news would have reached him the way news reached Kamakura, through the channels that connected the Minamoto government to its forces in the field. The confirmation that the Taira fleet had been destroyed, that the boy emperor had died in the sea, that Kenrei Moin had been pulled from the water against her will, that the Taira as a military and political force no longer existed. For Shigehira, this news meant something specific. His brothers, Munemori and the others who had survived Ichinotani and continued the war in the West, were now dead or captured. The clan he had been born into, the family whose name he carried, the power structure that had defined his entire life until 1180, no longer existed in any form that could meaningfully continue. Shigehira in Kamakura was now one of very few surviving Taira leaders, and the question of his fate, which had remained unresolved during the period when the war was still being fought, no longer had the same strategic considerations attached to it. The decision that was eventually made about Shigehira involved sending him back to Nara. This decision needs to be understood in terms of what Nara represented, both to Shigehira specifically and to the broader process of resolution that the end of the Genpei War required. The temples of Nara, Todaiji, and Kohukuji had been devastated in 1180. The religious establishment had been seeking for years some form of acknowledgement, some form of resolution to what had happened, and Shigehira, as the surviving Taira commander most directly associated with the events of that night, represented the most direct available means of providing that resolution. The journey from Kamakura back toward Nara retraced, in reverse, the journey Shigehira had made the year before, from Ichinotani to Kamakura. But the circumstances were different now. The war was over. The Taira no longer existed as a fighting force. Shigehira was not being taken to an uncertain fate that might, depending on political circumstances, resolve in various ways. He was being taken to Nara specifically for a specific purpose, and the purpose was understood by everyone involved, including almost certainly Shigehira himself. What Senjuno Mae felt as Shigehira was taken from Kamakura toward his final destination is not directly recorded, but the relationship that had developed during his captivity, the recognition of him as a person, the appreciation of his poetry and music, suggests that her response to his departure was not indifference. Some accounts suggest that she grieved, that the connection formed during those months in Kamakura had been real enough that Shigehira's departure, and what it meant, affected her in ways that went beyond the formal relationship between a captive and his attendant. Shigehira left Kamakura carrying, perhaps, some version of what he had carried on the journey east the year before: poetry, music, the specific quality of bearing that had, even in captivity, made an impression on the people around him. He was going to Nara. He was going to the place where, 4 years and 5 months earlier, the Daibutsu had burned. The road to Nara in the summer of 1185 was a different road from the one Shigehira had traveled 5 years before, when he had led a force toward what was supposed to be a routine suppression of local hostilities. That journey had been the journey of a commander, 25 years old, at the head of a military force, moving toward an objective that was, at the outset, unremarkable. This journey was the journey of a prisoner, 29 years old, moving toward a destination that everyone understood would be the end. Nara itself had changed in the 5 years since the fire. The chronicles describe the scale of the destruction that had occurred that night, and the years since had been spent by the surviving religious community in the early stages of what would become a massive reconstruction effort, the rebuilding of Todaiji and Kohukuji, a project that would, in fact, take decades, extending well beyond the lifetimes of everyone involved in 1185. Shigehira, arriving in Nara in the summer of 1185, would have seen a landscape that bore the visible marks of what had happened, the absence of structures that had stood for centuries, the early evidence of rebuilding efforts, the specific quality of a place that has been devastated and is in the slow process of recovery. This was the place he was being brought to. This was the place where, according to the decision that had been made, the resolution of his fate would occur. The specific reasoning behind this choice of location is not difficult to understand. Nara represented the wound that Shigehira's actions had inflicted. For the resolution of his fate to occur anywhere else, in Kamakura, or in some other location connected to the Minamoto, or to the broader political settlement of the war, would have been, in a sense, incomplete. Nara was where the offense had occurred. Nara, in some sense, was owed a resolution that occurred on its own ground. The accounts of Shigehira's final days describe him continuing, to the extent the circumstances allowed, the practices that had defined his captivity in Kamakura. Religious observance. This is worth noting specifically. Shigehira, in his final period, is described as engaging seriously with Buddhist practice, a turn that, given everything that had happened, given that the central fact of his life, the thing he was known for and was now, in the most direct way, being held accountable for, was an offense against the Buddhist order, carries a particular weight. Whether this represented genuine spiritual development, a response to the specific circumstances he found himself in, or some combination, is not something the records allow us to determine with certainty. What is recorded is that he engaged with the practice in the time that remained to him. The location chosen for the final resolution of Shigehira's fate was the Kizukawa, the Kizu River, which runs near Nara, in the area between the old capital and the surrounding provinces. A river is a significant location in the geography of this kind of event, in the cultural framework of the period. Rivers represented, in various ways, boundaries, the crossing from one state to another, and the choice of a riverside location for what was about to happen carries, in the symbolic vocabulary of the period, a specific resonance. Shigehira was brought to the Kizukawa. The people of Nara, or representatives of the religious community that had been devastated 5 years before, were present. The execution of Shigehira took place at the Kizugawa in the 6th month of 1185, a little more than a year after Dan Nura, a little more than 4.5 years after Nara. The accounts of this event are, in the Heike Monogatari and related texts, treated with a specific kind of attention, the same kind of attention that the chronicle gives to other significant deaths. Atsumori on the beach, the Taira commanders who chose the sea over capture at Dan-nora, Kenrei Moin's attempted entry into the water, and her rescue against her will. Shigehira's death is part of this sequence of significant endings, and the chronicle handles it with the same combination of specific detail and larger resonance that characterizes its treatment of the others. What the accounts emphasize is Shigehira's bearing in the final moments. This is consistent with everything that has been recorded about him since his capture at Ichinotani, the dignity that had impressed the warriors who escorted him to Kamakura, the cultivation that Senjuno Mae had valued, the engagement with Buddhist practice in his final period. The chronicle presents Shigehira meeting his end with the composure that the warrior culture valued, and that the Buddhist framework he had been engaging with provided its own resources for. He had, according to the accounts, made his peace, to whatever extent peace was available to a man in his circumstances. The location, the Kizugawa, near Nara, meant that Shigehira's death occurred within sight, or at least within proximity, of the temples he had been associated with burning. This proximity was not incidental. It was, in the understanding of everyone involved, the point. The man who had been at Nara in 1180, whatever the precise mechanics of his responsibility for what happened that night, was now, 5 years later, meeting his end near the same place, in a resolution that the religious community had, in some sense, been waiting for since the fire. There is a way of reading this resolution that emphasizes its quality as justice, as the closing of a circle that had been opened in 1180, the man responsible for the destruction of the Daibutsu meeting his end near the site of that destruction, a symmetry that the Buddhist understanding of karma would have found appropriate, even necessary. There is another way of reading it that emphasizes its quality as tragedy, the young man who had been, in 1180, a fifth son with a temper and a striking appearance and not much else, who had been given a command in circumstances he had not fully chosen, and whose actions in that command, whatever their precise nature, had defined the rest of his life and ultimately ended it. Both readings are present in how the Heike Monogatari handles Shigehira. The chronicle does not choose between them. Shigehira died at the Kizugawa in 1185. He was 29 years old, the fifth son of Kiyomori, the man associated with Nara, the captive whose poetry and music had been valued in Kamakura, the prisoner who had engaged with Buddhist practice in his final months, died near the city whose great temples had burned under his command 5 years before. The Taira, as a clan, no longer existed. His brothers were dead. His sister was in a mountain temple, beginning the religious life that would define the rest of her years. Shigehira's death was, in a sense, one of the last acts of the war, a resolution that occurred after the war itself had ended, a settling of an account that had been open since before Dan-nora, before Ichinotani, before any of the events that had defined the war's final years. It went back to Nara. It always went back to Nara. The Daibutsu was rebuilt. This took decades. The reconstruction of Tadaiji and the great bronze image that had stood there for over 4 centuries before Shigehira's forces came to Nara was a project that extended across multiple generations, funded and organized by the religious community, and, eventually, by the very government that had emerged from the war that Shigehira had been part of. The new Daibutsu was completed and consecrated years after Shigehira's death, years after the Taira had ceased to exist as anything but a memory and a story. The Buddha that stands at Todaiji today is, in its essential form, the Buddha that was rebuilt in the aftermath of the fire that Shigehira's forces caused. Shigehira's story occupies a specific place in the larger structure of the Heike Monogatari, a place that is different from Kenrei Moen's, different from Kumagai Naozane's, different from Tomonori's. Kenrei Moen survived into a long aftermath of prayer and reflection. Kumagai Naozane survived into a transformation, the warrior who became the monk. Shigehira did not survive. His story is the story of someone who did something catastrophic, who carried the weight of it for years, who was, in the final period of his life, recognized as more than the catastrophe, as a person of genuine depth and cultivation, and who then paid, with his life, for what had happened that night in 1180. The question of Shigehira's guilt, in the strict sense, the question of whether he personally ordered the fire that destroyed the Daibutsu, or whether the fire was an accident that occurred in the chaos of a military engagement he commanded, is a question that the historical record does not definitively resolve. The chronicles themselves present both possibilities, sometimes within the same account. What is not in question is that Shigehira bore the responsibility, in the way that responsibility worked in this culture, for what happened under his command. He did not, by the accounts that survive, attempt to escape this responsibility. He carried it, through the remaining years of the war, through captivity, to the Kizugawa. There is something in Shigehira's story that resonates with the larger themes of the Heike Monogatari, the impermanence of fortune, the way that a single night, a single decision or sequence of events, can define a life in ways that nothing before it or after it can undo. Shigehira was, before Nara, a fifth son with a temper and an appearance that people noticed and not much else. After Nara, he was the man who burned the Buddha, a designation that overrode everything else about him, that followed him to Ichinotani, to Kamakura, to the Kizugawa. And yet, in Kamakura, in his final months, something else was also visible: the poetry, the music, the dignity, the engagement with the very tradition he had, in 1180, been responsible for wounding. The man who burned the Buddha spent his final months in prayer. This is not a resolution, in the sense of a clean ending that ties together the threads of a story. It is, instead, the kind of complexity that the Heike Monogatari specializes in, the recognition that people contain more than the single act that defines them in the historical record, that Shigehira was, simultaneously, the commander whose forces burned Todaiji and Kohokuji, and a man who, in his final months, turned toward the Buddhist practice that the institutions he had damaged existed to embody. Both of these were true. The chronicle holds them together, the way it holds together the rise and the fall, the beauty and the loss, the things that the opening lines of the Heike Monogatari announce as the subject of everything that follows. The proud do not endure. Shigehira did not endure, but what he was, in the time he had, was more than the fire that defined him. The chronicle remembers both,